There's a moment you know well. Something good is happening, a conversation, a season of your life, a person who makes you feel like yourself. And instead of being in it, you're already doing the math. How long will this last? What happens when it ends? How much it will hurt when it does? You tell yourself, that's just being realistic. That's what careful people do. It isn't. What you're actually doing is grieving something that hasn't ended yet. You're living inside a loss that exists only in your mind, while the real thing, the actual conversation, the actual person, the actual moment, sits in front of you, untouched. Not because you don't care, because you care so much that you've turned love into a form of dread. This is the central confusion of modern life. We've been taught that the problem is impermanence, that things end, that people leave, that the body decays, that nothing lasts. And if that's the problem, the solution seems obvious. Hold tighter, build more security, make it permanent. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to freeze what is by nature fluid, to possess what is by nature passing, to guarantee what was never ours to guarantee in the first place. But the suffering doesn't come from the fact that things end. The suffering comes from the war you wage against that fact. Alan Watts understood this with a precision that most Western philosophy had missed entirely. A British philosopher who spent his life translating Eastern thought, particularly Buddhism and Taoism, into language the Western mind could actually receive, Watts didn't offer comfort. He offered something more destabilizing than that. He argued that insecurity is not the disease. The attempt to escape insecurity is the disease, that the desperate pursuit of permanence is itself the source of the anxiety it's trying to cure. A vicious circle dressed up as a survival strategy. The Wisdom of Insecurity, published in 1951, makes a claim that sounds almost offensive in its simplicity. You are suffering not because life is uncertain, but because you cannot stop pretending that it isn't. Every strategy you've developed to feel safe, the identities you maintain, the futures you plan, the relationships you try to control, is an attempt to wrap running water in paper. The water always wins. And each time it does, you don't question the strategy, you just try to wrap it tighter. What Watts discovered, and what this video will take apart piece by piece, is that the moment you stop fighting impermanence, something unexpected happens. Not despair, not collapse. Something that feels, for the first time, like actual relief. The place to start is where the trap is set, in the idea that security is something you can find. Security is not a destination. It is a habit of reaching for something that recedes the moment you approach it. Watts identified what he called the backwards law, the principle that the harder you pursue certain things, the faster they disappear. Try to stay on the surface of water, and you sink. Hold your breath to keep it, and you lose it. The same logic governs the pursuit of psychological security. The more aggressively you seek it, the more intensely you feel its absence. Not because you're doing it wrong, because the pursuit itself generates the feeling it's trying to eliminate. This isn't a paradox you can think your way out of. It's a structural feature of how the anxious mind operates. Here's what the loop actually looks like. You feel insecure about a relationship, a career, your health, your future. So you reach for something solid, a plan, a commitment, a guarantee. And for a moment, it works. The anxiety quiets. But because the world doesn't stop moving, the solid thing shifts. The plan changes, the commitment wavers, the guarantee turns out to be provisional. And now you feel more insecure than before, because you invested in permanence and permanence failed you. So, you reach harder. The circle closes. Watts was blunt about where this ends. A society built on the quest for security is, in his words, nothing but a breath retention contest. Everyone straining, no one breathing, the tension itself mistaken for the point. What makes this especially difficult to see is that the Western mind was specifically trained to treat permanence as the measure of value. If something lasts, it matters. If something ends, it was fragile, maybe not real. We apply this logic to relationships, to careers, to identity itself. A marriage that ends is a failed marriage. A phase of life you outgrow is something you lost. A version of yourself you left behind is something that was taken from you. But this framework contains a flaw so fundamental that Watts spent an entire book dismantling it. The flaw is this: you are not looking for security because security will make you happy. You are looking for it because the feeling of insecurity is unbearable, and you have never been taught to be with it. Those are entirely different problems with entirely different solutions. The first is a logistical challenge. The second is a confrontation with the nature of experience itself. The craving for security and the feeling of insecurity are not opposites. They are the same thing, cycling. To want to be protected from the flux of life is to want to be separate from life. And it is precisely that sense of separateness, the I sealed off from everything around it, that produces the loneliness and fear that security was supposed to cure. You cannot fix a problem that you are generating by trying to fix it. What's underneath that loop, what's actually driving all of it, is something Watts identified as the deepest illusion the mind carries, the belief that there is a fixed, permanent self that needs to be protected in the first place. That belief is where we're going next. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The self you are trying to protect does not exist the way you think it does. This is not a philosophical provocation. It is a description of what happens when you look directly at what you call I and try to locate it. Watts, drawing from both Buddhist inquiry and direct observation, noticed something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The self is not a thing. It is a process, a river, not a rock. And everything you have built around the assumption that it is permanent, every identity, every self-concept, every story about who you are, is a convention imposed on something that was never fixed to begin with. Consider what you actually find when you try to observe the I. You find thoughts, feelings, sensations, memories, each one arriving, existing briefly, dissolving. The sense of a continuous self watching all of this is itself just another thought, a rapid sequence of experiences that memory stitches into the illusion of a stable observer. Watts put it precisely. Consciousness is not a tablet upon which life writes a record. It is the river flowing along with the writing. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago, not just philosophically, biochemically, psychologically, structurally. The body you inhabit has replaced nearly every cell. The beliefs you held have shifted. The things that frightened you have changed. And yet you carry this feeling of being a continuous, coherent I that has simply moved through time unchanged. That feeling is the convention. The change was the reality all along. Here is where this becomes personally dangerous. When you identify completely with a fixed version of yourself, I am this kind of person. I have always been this way. This is who I am. You are not describing yourself. You are imprisoning yourself. You are taking something fluid and dynamic and insisting it stay still. And then you suffer, not because life is cruel, but because life keeps moving and you keep demanding that it doesn't. The person who says, "I've always been anxious," is not reporting a fact. They are maintaining a story. The person who says, "I'm not the kind of person who changes," is not being honest about themselves. They are defending a construction. Watts would say that the tragedy is not that people can't change. It is that they have mistaken a temporary pattern for a permanent truth, and now they protect that mistake as if it were their identity. And they do protect it, fiercely, because if the self is not fixed, if who you are right now is just one temporary configuration of something always in motion, then the ground disappears. There is nothing solid to stand on. That terror is real. But Watts asks you to look at it differently. The ground was never there. What you called ground was always just water moving slowly enough to seem still. The terror of that recognition is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the sensation of finally seeing clearly. A self that is not fixed, cannot be permanently broken, cannot be permanently defined, cannot be permanently trapped. If you are a process rather than a thing, then no failure is final. No identity is a cage. No version of yourself is the last word on who you are. The freedom Watts is pointing to is not freedom from change. It is the freedom that comes from finally being what you actually are, which is change itself. But recognizing this intellectually is not enough. There is another layer to this, one most people find even harder to face. What happens when the change is painful? What happens when the moment you are in is not one you want? That is where we are going next, into the part of Watts's argument that cuts deepest. Every strategy you have for dealing with pain is making it worse, not because you are weak, because the strategy itself, the attempt to separate yourself from what you feel, to get the I out of the experience, is structurally incapable of working. Watts saw this with unusual clarity. The thing you call suffering is rarely just the pain. It is the pain plus the desperate effort to not be in it. And that second layer, the resistance, the bracing, the internal running, is often more exhausting than the original wound. Think about what actually happens when fear arrives. The feeling comes, and immediately something else activates. A voice, a posture, a strategy. Name it, contain it, explain it, escape it. You call it anxiety, and by naming it, you have already tried to put distance between yourself and it. You think about why you feel it, what caused it, how long it will last. You monitor it, you negotiate with it, you tell yourself you shouldn't feel it. And all of this activity, all of this busy, frantic mental labor, is the I trying to stand outside the experience and manage it from a safe distance. But there is no safe distance. You cannot remove your head from a headache the way you remove your hand from a flame. Watts draws a distinction that most therapeutic frameworks miss entirely. The problem is not that you feel pain. The problem is that you feel pain and simultaneously feel an I that is separate from the pain and cannot tolerate it. That split between the experiencer and the experience is what turns ordinary suffering into torment. Because now you are not just in pain. You are in pain and fighting yourself for being in pain, which produces more pain, which requires more fighting. The solution Watts proposes sounds passive, but is actually one of the most demanding things he asks. Stop trying to get out. Not because escape is morally wrong, but because escape is impossible. And the attempt is what sustains the agony. When you are fully aware of fear without naming it, without calling it bad, without trying to be someone who is not afraid, something shifts, not immediately, not dramatically. But the second layer of suffering, the layer made of resistance, begins to dissolve. What remains is the original feeling, which is almost always more bearable than the war you were waging against it. This is not acceptance in the passive, defeated sense. It is precision. It is seeing the experience as it actually is, rather than as the story your mind constructs about it. And what awareness reveals, consistently, is that the feeling is far more fluid than the label you attach to it. Fear moves, grief moves, pain moves. It is only the I insisting on standing outside it that makes it feel permanent, solid, unbearable. There is a Chinese story Watts returns to, the sage who is asked how to escape the heat of suffering. His answer, go right into the middle of the fire. Not because suffering is good, because the only way out is through, and through requires that you stop pretending there is an I separate enough from the fire to escape it. What this unlocks is something Watts considers essential and almost entirely overlooked. The present moment, experienced without division, is not something to endure. It is something to actually inhabit. And when you finally inhabit it, when the split between I and this experience collapses, the texture of even an ordinary moment changes completely. That is where we are going next. Not to pain, but to what becomes possible when you are fully inside a moment rather than managing it from the outside. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. You have been told in various ways that the fact that things end is the tragedy. Watts says it is the source of all value. This is not consolation. It is not the kind of thing someone says to make loss more bearable. It is a structural claim about how beauty, meaning, and presence actually work. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Consider music. The reason a melody moves you is precisely because it is moving, passing through time, each note disappearing the instant it sounds. If you could freeze it, hold the chord in place, make it last, it would immediately stop being music. It would become noise. The beauty is inseparable from the passing. Watts understood this not as a poetic observation, but as a precise description of how all experience operates. The perishability is not incidental to the value. It is the mechanism of the value. A flower is beautiful because it will not last, not despite that fact, because of it. If it were permanent, you would stop seeing it within a week. You would walk past it the way you walk past walls. The transience is what keeps demanding your attention, what prevents the eye from going dull, what makes each instance of it feel like something worth witnessing. Impermanence is not the enemy of beauty. It is the engine of it. Now apply this to what you actually love. The relationships that have mattered most to you, not in spite of their fragility, but through it. The seasons of your life that you remember with the sharpest clarity, precisely because they ended. The conversations that felt completely alive, because neither of you knew exactly where they were going. The intensity you feel in the presence of someone you love is not separate from the knowledge, somewhere underneath, that this too is temporary. That knowledge is not ruining the moment. It is what is making the moment matter. What Watts is identifying is the mechanism behind presence itself. You cannot be fully present in something you are trying to freeze. The attempt to hold the moment is what causes you to miss it. The person who spends a dinner thinking about how much they'll miss this when it's over is not at dinner. They are at a funeral that hasn't happened yet. And the moment, the actual, living, unrepeatable moment, passes without them. This is where the modern incapacity for presence becomes visible in its full absurdity. We reach for the phone to photograph the sunset because the photograph will last. But in reaching for permanence, we exit the very thing we were trying to preserve. The photograph is not the sunset. It is the proof that we were too afraid of impermanence to actually be there. Watts would say, the problem is not that you love things too much. It is that you love them in the wrong direction, toward possession rather than participation. You want to own the moment instead of inhabiting it. And ownership requires distance. You cannot hold something and be inside it at the same time. The radical proposal is this: let the temporariness intensify your attention rather than poison it. When you are with someone you love, the fact that this will not last forever is not a threat to be suppressed. It is the thing that makes now irreplaceable. Each moment is not a fragment of something longer. It is complete in itself, the way a piece of music is complete in each measure, not only at the final chord. But there is one more thing that impermanence demands of you. Something harder than presence, harder than attention. It demands that you learn to let go without collapsing. And most people have never been taught how to do that. When something ends, you find out exactly how much of yourself you built inside it. A relationship ends, and you don't just lose the person, you lose the version of yourself that existed in relation to them. The one who was loved in that particular way, who had that particular role, who knew who they were because of how they were reflected back. A career collapses, and what falls with it is not just the income, but the identity. The phase of life closes, and what you grieve is not only what's gone, but the self that belonged to it. This is the collapse Watts is diagnosing. Not weakness, not failure to cope. A structural consequence of having built your sense of self inside something that was always going to be temporary. Watts draws a distinction that is easy to miss, but changes everything. The distinction is between love and attachment. They feel similar from the inside. Both involve intensity. Both involve caring deeply. But they operate on entirely different logics. Love moves towards something. Attachment grips it. Love can be fully present with what is here. Attachment is already afraid of the moment it ends. Love flows. Attachment suffocates. The thing it holds and the person holding it. What makes attachment so hard to see in yourself is that it disguises itself as love. You tell yourself you care so much that you cannot imagine losing it. But Watts would ask you to look more carefully. Is it the person you cannot imagine losing? Or is it the continuity, the security, the definition of self that they provide? Is it love that makes you grip? Or is it fear dressed as devotion? This is not an accusation. It is a question worth sitting with. The person who collapses when something ends has not loved too much. They have identified too completely. They have taken something fluid, a relationship, a role, a phase, and made it the foundation of a self that was supposed to be permanent. And when the fluid thing moves, as fluid things always do, the foundation goes with it. Watts's point is not that you should love less. It is that love does not require permanence to be real. A relationship that ends was not therefore meaningless. A phase of life that closes was not therefore wasted. The ending does not retroactively drain the experience of its value, unless you have decided that only permanent things count. And that decision, quietly, is what makes every loss catastrophic. To let go without collapsing is not a technique. It is a consequence. It follows naturally when you have stopped building your identity inside temporary things, not because you don't care about them, but because you have stopped needing them to be permanent in order to justify caring. You can love what is here fully and release what has gone cleanly. Not because you are detached, but because your wholeness was never actually located in the thing you lost. This is what Watts means when he points toward the undivided mind. A mind that is not split between I and my experience does not collapse when experience changes, because it was never separate from the flow to begin with. It moves with what moves. It releases what passes, not passively, but without the catastrophic shattering that comes from having confused the river with the banks. There is one final turn to make. Everything in this video, the trap of security, the fluid self, the pain you stop running from, the beauty that lives inside transience, the love that doesn't grip, all of it converges on a single point, the only moment that has ever existed, the only place where any of this can actually be practiced. That is where we are going now. You are not going to be present someday. You are going to be present now, or you are not going to be present at all. This is not a motivational statement. It is a description of reality so obvious that it has become invisible. The present moment is not one option among many. It is the only location where experience actually occurs. The past exists as memory, which is a present experience. The future exists as anticipation, which is also a present experience. There is nowhere else. There has never been anywhere else. And yet most people spend the overwhelming majority of their lives somewhere other than here. Watts watched this with a kind of philosophical astonishment. The brain, he argued, had developed the extraordinary capacity to remember and predict, and then proceeded to use that capacity to make the present almost entirely inaccessible. You are eating and thinking about the conversation you had this morning. You are with someone you love and rehearsing what you will say later. You are in the middle of your life and waiting for it to properly begin. The instrument that was supposed to enrich experience has been weaponized against it. And here is where everything in this video converges. The reason you cannot be present is not distraction, it is fear. Specifically, it is the fear of impermanence, the terror of being fully inside a moment that will end. If you let yourself be completely here, you will also feel completely how brief here is. So you stay slightly outside it, you manage it, you observe it, you document it, you plan what comes after it. Anything to avoid the rawness of full contact with something you cannot keep. But what's identified what that strategy costs? A life lived at one remove from experience is not a protected life. It is a missed life. The security you were buying with your absence was never real. The moment passed anyway, and you were not in it. The practice Watts points toward is not meditation in the formal sense, though it resembles it. It is simpler and more relentless than that. It is the repeated act of noticing when you have left the present, when you are grieving the past or rehearsing the future, and returning. Not with discipline, with recognition. The moment you see that you are somewhere other than here, you are already back. Awareness of absence is itself a form of presence. This is the concrete thing Watts leaves you with, and it is not comfortable. The next time something good is happening, a conversation, a meal, a moment of unexpected clarity, and you feel the familiar pull toward calculation, toward grief in advance, toward the subtle management of experience rather than the experience itself, stop, not to fix it, just to see it. See the mechanism operating, see the hand reaching to freeze the water. You do not need to force yourself back into the moment. The seeing is the return. And the next time something ends, as things will end, as they have always ended, as they are ending right now in ways too slow to notice, resist the impulse to locate the loss somewhere permanent. Ask instead what was actually there, what was real in it. Whether the ending changes that. It doesn't. The river was real while it ran. The running was the point. If something in this video has unsettled something in you, a belief about permanence, about security, about what you've been protecting and why, that unsettlement is not a problem to resolve. It is the beginning of something. Watts spent a lifetime pointing at a door that most people spend their lives decorating the wall around. Leave a comment below about what you're holding on to that you already know you cannot keep. The answers will tell you more about yourself than any plan you've made for the future. There is more to examine. Other thinkers, other frameworks, other ways that the mind constructs the cage it suffers inside. That examination doesn't end here. It continues every time you return to this question, and you will return to it.